They told people never to ask about the Whitmore plantation after sundown. Locals said the walls still whispered that someone, or something, walked those halls long after the master was gone. But what they didn't say was why. Why did a wealthy man in 1852 Alabama spend his fortune on 7 women he would never put to work? Why did he isolate them from the fields, build them a separate cabin, and forbid anyone from speaking their names aloud? And most disturbingly, why was every record of one woman among them erased? What happened inside that house was buried under generations of silence. Because if the truth ever came out, it would shatter the story the South told itself about its past. Alabama in 1852 was a place suspended between wealth and rot, a landscape gilded by cotton but soaked in blood. The fields stretched endlessly under a humid sky, the air thick with the hum of insects and the sound of chains dragging through dirt. Every sunrise meant labor, every sunset meant silence, and between them hung the illusion of prosperity. It was a world built on forced obedience, and it thrived because no one dared to call it what it truly was, an empire of cruelty wrapped in civility. The plantation masters saw themselves as kings, ordained by birth and by God, their ledgers filled with names instead of numbers, human beings treated as assets. The law, the church, even the economy conspired to make this horror appear natural. In Alabama's grand parlors, conversations about the price of a man's soul took place over tea and fine china. The hypocrisy was so deep that it was invisible. Like humidity you could not see but could never escape. The year 1852 stood near the height of that delusion. Cotton was booming, trade was profitable, and the great plantations were growing richer by the day. But beneath the veneer of success, the South was haunted by its own conscience. There were whispers, quiet and unwelcome, of rebellion, of guilt, of divine judgment. Preachers spoke of salvation, but their sermons were written to soothe the masters, not the enslaved. The system was so vast that even those who doubted it could not imagine life without it. Every brick of every mansion was laid by hands that were unpaid, every meal seasoned with someone else's suffering. The moral rot had become the foundation of daily life. The Whitmore plantation was one of many, yet somehow apart. Set on a ridge that overlooked the Tombigbee River, its land was rich, fertile, and heavy with secrets. Travelers who passed through Monroe County would point to it from the dusty road, saying its owner, Silas Whitmore, was not like the others. They didn't mean kinder or gentler, only stranger. Whitmore was a man of quiet demeanor, but with a presence that unsettled even the most hardened overseer. He seldom spoke, and when he did, it was in the clipped language of a man used to giving orders but not explanations. People said his wife had died the previous winter, taken by fever, though some claimed it was grief that killed her. There were rumors she had thrown herself into the river on a moonless night, her white dress seen drifting downstream like a ghostly flag of surrender. But such stories were dismissed as superstition, something to fill the space between work and whiskey. Silas inherited his estate from his father, a veteran of the early slave trade who had taught him the cruel arithmetic of ownership. From boyhood, Silas learned how to measure profit by pain. Yet even as he enforced the old system, something in him had begun to decay. Those who knew him before the war said he had been ambitious, eager, hungry for status. But after Eleanor's death, that fire turned inward, burning silently, consuming him from within. He stopped attending social gatherings. He dismissed half his servants and retreated into the big house like a man possessed by regret. The halls that once echoed with laughter became mausoleums of memory, filled with portraits turned to face the walls and mirrors covered in black cloth. The slaves whispered that the master spoke to the dead at night, that he left candles burning until morning, and that the scent of lilacs, his wife's perfume, still drifted through the corridors long after her burial. To understand Alabama in that moment is to understand a society at war with its own reflection. Men like Whitmore could quote scripture as easily as they could order a whipping. They lived by a code that fused religion with dominance, convincing themselves that their cruelty was divine justice. The economy demanded obedience, and the church sanctified it. But under the surface, cracks had begun to form. Enslaved people whispered stories of freedom carried by travelers from the north. Some had heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, published that same year, and though most would never read it, its spirit moved through the country like a rumor of awakening. masters feared not the lash of heaven, but the uprising of those they had wronged. Each rebellion, each act of defiance, each whisper of escape made them tighten their grip and their paranoia. It was in this atmosphere that Silas Whitmore made his inexplicable purchase. In an age when buying human lives was ordinary, the strangeness was not in the act itself, but in the intention behind it. At the Montgomery market, where bodies were inspected like livestock, Whitmore appeared not as a businessman, but as a mourner. Witnesses described how he walked among the rows of chained women in silence, his gloved hands folded behind his back. He stopped at 7, young, healthy, all with some trace of beauty or refinement, and purchased them outright, paying more than their market worth. To the auctioneer's surprise, he asked for no labor record, no skill assessment. He didn't even request to see their teeth, a common cruelty of the trade. When questioned, he said, "They are not for labor. They are for redemption." The words hung heavy, absurd, and faintly blasphemous. People wondered what he meant. Some assumed madness had overtaken him. Others whispered that he was trying to build a harem, or perhaps to summon his dead wife's spirit through forbidden rituals. But no one dared challenge him openly. A man of his wealth could afford eccentricity. In truth, Whitmore himself might not have known why he did it. Something in him, a fracture between grief and guilt, compelled the act. He brought the 7 women to his estate in the dead of night, instructing that they be housed away from the main quarters. He ordered new garments for them, simple but clean, and allowed them to read from the Bible each evening. Such gestures of humanity were unheard of, and they frightened the overseers more than any act of violence could. The surrounding fields, meanwhile, continued their brutal rhythm. Overseers shouted, whips cracked, and the cotton was harvested as always. But inside the Whitmore mansion, time seemed to slow, as if the outside world no longer existed. The purchase of the 7 women marked the beginning of something that would soon blur the line between benevolence and obsession. For in that year, in that place, even a flicker of compassion carried the scent of sin, and whatever haunted Silas Whitmore was not done with him yet. The winds that rolled across Alabama carried more than heat. They carried whispers of reckoning, and the first signs of a story that would stain the soil long after everyone who lived it was gone. Silas Whitmore was not born a monster. He was born into a world that trained him to become one. His father, Edward Whitmore, had built the family's fortune on the backs of hundreds of enslaved people, expanding their land and wealth through cruelty masked as commerce. From the moment Silas could walk, he was made to understand that his value and his survival depended on control. He learned to read ledgers before letters, to judge a man's worth not by his character but by his price at market. The Whitmore estate, vast and thriving, became both his inheritance and his curse. Every tree, every blade of grass seemed to whisper that he owed his comfort to suffering. But that whisper was one he ignored for most of his life. It was easier to believe what he'd been taught, that his family's power was natural, ordained, and eternal. Those who met Silas as a young man described him as intelligent but cold. He had a kind of restrained charm, a deliberate slowness in his speech that gave him an air of authority. He rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it carried the weight of finality. He studied law briefly in Montgomery, though he never practiced. His father's death in 1847 pulled him back to the plantation, and there he remained, tending to crops and accounts as if the outside world no longer existed. Yet beneath his controlled exterior lay something unsteady, a mind that searched for meaning beyond profit. He read the Greek philosophers by candlelight and scribbled strange notes in the margins of his Bible. Neighbors would later recall that he spoke often of sin, not as a moral failing, but as a kind of infection that lived inside bloodlines. It was as if he already sensed that his family's wealth carried a curse. In 1849, he married Eleanor Hayes, the daughter of a merchant from Mobile. She was his opposite, spirited, educated, and fond of challenging his rigid beliefs. Theirs was not a match of love at first, but one of convenience that slowly softened into something genuine. Eleanor was known for her compassion toward the enslaved people who worked on the estate. She would sneak food to the children, teach them hymns, and leave small tokens on their doorsteps during Christmas. Silas tolerated it at first, seeing it as harmless sentimentality, but as her kindness grew bolder, so did the tension between them. She began urging him to release the sick and elderly workers, to end punishments, to let some go free. Silas refused. The plantation's wealth depended on those lives, and to undo it meant to undo himself. Their arguments became routine. Her tears met with his silence met with her despair. By the time the winter of 1851 arrived, their marriage had become a ghost of its former self. Eleanor fell ill after a fever spread through the quarters. Some said she had been tending to an enslaved woman with pneumonia and caught it herself. Others whispered that it was something darker, that she had been poisoned, perhaps by someone who resented her compassion. Silas never spoke of it. He buried her on the north side of the property, beneath a magnolia tree she had planted years earlier. After the funeral, he dismissed the servants who had cared for her and boarded up her sitting room. From that day forward, he began to drift into solitude, his grief curdling into obsession. The years following her death changed Silas in ways that frightened even those closest to him. His overseer, Thomas Hale, said that he would spend entire nights walking the perimeter of the fields, whispering to the air as though speaking to someone unseen. He stopped shaving, stopped attending church, and began burning candles at odd hours, performing strange rituals that blended scripture with superstition. Visitors described the house as lifeless, its windows always shuttered, its gardens overgrown. The only sign of movement came from the faint glow of candlelight behind the upper windows at night. Inside, he had filled Eleanor's old piano room with her belongings, arranging them as though she might return at any moment. Servants heard him speaking softly in that room, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. And then there were the letters, pages upon pages addressed to Eleanor, written in his delicate handwriting. Each one ending with the same line, "You were not meant to leave me." His isolation deepened into something almost ritualistic. He began collecting items, rings, ribbons, locks of hair, from the graves of the enslaved, keeping them in a wooden chest that once held his wife's jewelry. When asked why, he told Thomas Hale that these objects were tokens of memory, fragments of what remains when the body is gone. He believed, perhaps truly, that through them he could find Eleanor again. But grief and madness often look alike, and no one dared challenge him. Power insulated him from reason. When a man owns hundreds of souls, there is no one left to save his own. It was during this descent that he began to speak of redemption. The word crept into his vocabulary like a mantra. To him, redemption was not salvation. It was atonement through possession, the act of controlling what one had destroyed. He started attending slave auctions again, not as a businessman, but as a pilgrim. He would walk among the rows of chained people with a haunted stillness, touching their faces as if searching for something familiar. Witnesses said that in Montgomery, days before he bought the 7 women, he stood before the crowd and murmured under his breath, "One of them has her eyes." At the time, no one understood what he meant. Only later, when the story spread through the county, did the meaning become clear. He was looking for his wife's reflection, convinced her spirit had returned in another form. His wealth allowed his eccentricities to go unchecked. Other landowners avoided him, fearing that his strangeness might tarnish their reputation. Yet the power of rumor gave him a kind of mythic presence. Children dared each other to shout his name near the plantation gate. Field hands crossed themselves when passing his land at night. He had become a living legend, half man, half curse. Some believed he practiced forbidden rites brought from Europe, remnants of old-world mysticism. Others said he was simply a broken man trying to bargain with death. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. By 1852, Silas had retreated completely from public life. He dismissed his preacher, cut ties with his church, and allowed his crops to rot in the fields. Yet his wealth remained untouched. The Whitmore family name still carried weight in every court and market in Alabama. He could do anything, buy anyone, and face no consequence. That power gave his grief a dangerous outlet. When he walked into the Montgomery market that fateful autumn day, he did so not as a buyer of labor, but as a seeker of ghosts. He examined the women with unsettling calm, asking questions no one else would dare. "Do you dream? Do you remember faces? Do you fear the dark?" The traders laughed, assuming he'd lost his mind. But to Silas, these were not women to exploit. They were vessels of something sacred and terrifying. The choice of 7 was deliberate. In the Bible, 7 symbolized completion, divine order, the cycle of creation and rest. He believed that through 7 he might summon balance again, undo the fracture that had destroyed his life. And when his gaze met that of a young woman named Clara, something in him shifted. She did not look away. Her eyes, calm and steady, seemed to pierce through the layers of his guilt. In that moment, Silas Whitmore, the master of the Whitmore plantation, the son of privilege and cruelty, began to believe in something far more dangerous than love or loss. He began to believe that the dead could return, and that redemption could be bought with coin. The morning of the auction was thick with humidity, the kind that made even the air feel heavy with judgment. Montgomery's slave market, a wide, dusty square lined with wooden pens, was alive with the sounds of trade. Chains clinking, men shouting, the dull murmur of haggling voices all rose and blended with the cries of people being displayed as property. It was the language of commerce wrapped around the cries of despair. Silas Whitmore stood apart from it, immaculate in a black coat despite the sweltering heat, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. He looked less like a buyer and more like a mourner, his stillness, his distance, unsettling to those who watched him. The traders greeted him cautiously, knowing his name carried weight. They whispered to each other about his fortune, his wife's death, his reclusion. Yet his arrival that morning carried an unfamiliar sense of purpose. There was no calculation in his expression, only an eerie calm that seemed to drain the sound from the air around him. The auctioneer, a red-faced man with a booming voice, paraded the enslaved women before the crowd as if they were livestock. Strong backs, good teeth, obedient temperaments, he shouted, the words rehearsed and hollow. Silas watched without emotion, his hands clasped behind him, his eyes moving slowly from face to face. To those observing, his gaze seemed almost clinical, detached, but in truth it was filled with searching. He wasn't assessing health or strength. He was searching for something deeper, something familiar. The auctioneer called his name twice before Silas stirred, finally stepping forward to examine a group of 7 women standing to the side. They were young, worn but not broken, their faces streaked with dust and sweat. Their expressions held a kind of quiet defiance mixed with exhaustion, the look of those who had learned that resistance must often be silent. When Silas stopped in front of them, the noise of the market seemed to fade. He studied them one by one. The first was tall, her posture proud despite the chains. The second trembled slightly when he met her gaze. The third whispered a prayer under her breath. But when he reached the 6th, something in his composure shifted. Her eyes, calm, steady, impossible to look away from, met his. Her name, he would later learn, was Clara. Her skin was the color of copper in sunlight, her features delicate but marked by resilience. She did not avert her eyes. That defiance, quiet and unwavering, caught him in a way he could not explain. He stared for too long, and the auctioneer cleared his throat impatiently, misreading the moment as indecision. "Fine lot, Mr. Whitmore," the man said, forcing a grin. "Strong women, no defects, good workers." Silas's voice was low when he finally replied, almost too soft to hear. "I'll take all 7. The word startled the crowd. Buying 1 or 2 was common. Buying 7 at once, without negotiation, was not. The auctioneer blinked, thinking he'd misheard. "All 7, sir?" "All 7, Silas repeated. He reached inside his coat, produced a pouch heavy with coins, and set it down on the wooden stand. "No need for inspection. I'll take them as they are." A hush fell. Even in a world accustomed to cruelty, this felt strange. Some thought it was excess, an act of arrogance. Others sensed something darker in the way he said it, as if he were making an offering rather than a purchase. The auctioneer, wary but eager for profit, nodded and began writing the bill of sale. Silas turned his gaze back to the women, his expression unreadable. One of them, a young woman named Ruth, dared to ask in a trembling voice, "Master, where will you take us?" He hesitated, then replied, "Home." The word carried neither warmth nor malice, only finality. It was not a promise, it was a sentence. The journey back to the Whitmore plantation took 2 days by wagon. Silas rode ahead on horseback, speaking little, while the 7 women were transported behind him in a covered cart guarded by 2 overseers. They passed through small towns where people stared, curious at the sight of so many women being escorted by only a few men. When they reached the outskirts of Monroe County, the landscape changed. The trees grew thicker, the road narrower, the silence deeper. The women whispered among themselves, wondering what awaited them. Some believed they would be sold again. Others thought they might be used for the house or worse. But none could have imagined what Silas had in mind. When they arrived at the plantation, it was dusk. The once grand house loomed over the fields, its white paint grayed with neglect. The air smelled of damp earth and old wood. Silas dismounted and gave a single order. The women were not to be taken to the slave quarters. Instead, he led them to an abandoned cabin near the edge of the property, a place long unused and half swallowed by vines. He ordered it cleaned and repaired, stocked with food, bedding, and candles. No one understood why. The overseers exchanged uneasy glances but followed orders without question. When one of them dared to ask if the women would be put to work in the fields, Silas's answer was short and cold. They are not for work. They are to be left alone. In the days that followed, confusion spread through the plantation. Workers whispered about the 7 women kept apart, about the master who visited them daily but never spoke more than a few words. Some said he was trying to create a choir to honor his dead wife. Others claimed he was conducting strange rituals in the night. Servants reported seeing candles burning in the windows of the cabin long after midnight, their flickering light moving like shadows that danced without sound. Once, a field hand swore he heard a woman singing softly in a language he did not recognize. When he told the overseer, he was whipped for spreading lies. Silas began to spend less time in the main house. His meals went untouched, his clothes unwashed. He took to writing again, his journals filled with fragmented thoughts, phrases like, memory reborn, eyes of the departed, the circle must be complete. Clara, meanwhile, became the quiet center of it all. Unlike the others, she seemed unafraid of him. When he entered the cabin, the rest would lower their eyes, but she would meet his gaze. He began bringing her books, allowing her to read aloud to him from Scripture. The words filled the silence between them like an incantation. Yet beneath the calm of those readings, something darker stirred. He began to see traces of Eleanor in her gestures, the tilt of her head, the cadence of her voice, the way she lingered on certain phrases. It was enough to convince him that his grief had not been in vain. He started calling her by his wife's name when he thought no one was listening. By the 3rd week, the overseers grew nervous. They whispered about leaving, afraid that their master had lost his mind. "He's not right," one said. "He's talking to ghosts." The other spat on the ground. "He's doing worse than that. He's trying to bring them back." But no one dared confront him directly. A man with Silas's money could indulge any madness he pleased. When the parish priest visited to check on him, Silas refused to come downstairs, sending a message instead. God is not welcome here until he explains himself. It was blasphemy, pure and cold, and it spread through the county like wildfire. Still, life on the plantation continued in its strange, suspended rhythm. The 7 women remained unseen except for brief glimpses through the trees. The fields grew quiet at night, the workers whispering prayers to ward off whatever had taken root on that land. And in the great house, Silas Whitmore, once a man of reason and reputation, sat alone by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the faint sound of a woman's voice drifting from the cabin beyond the fields, a voice that sounded too much like the one he had buried beneath the magnolia tree. Clara's presence in the Whitmore plantation was unlike anything that land had ever known. From the moment she arrived, there was something about her that unsettled everyone, though few could explain it. She was quiet but not timid, reserved but never submissive. While the other 6 women moved cautiously, waiting for commands, Clara seemed to exist beyond fear. She obeyed, but there was a precision to it, as if she were choosing compliance rather than being forced into it. Her silence carried weight. When she walked through the narrow cabin, the others lowered their voices, as if some invisible rule demanded it. Even the overseers, hardened by years of cruelty, avoided her gaze. One described her later as a shadow with eyes that see too much. Whitmore noticed it immediately. He visited the cabin often, always under the pretext of bringing food or checking on their conditions. But it was Clara he looked at. The others faded into the background when she entered the room. There was something painfully familiar in the way she moved, in the calm tilt of her head when she listened to him speak. On the 2nd evening after their arrival, as she stood near the window brushing her hair, the fading light caught her face in such a way that Whitmore's breath caught. The curve of her jaw, the stillness in her expression, it struck him like memory made flesh. In that moment she was Eleanor. Not merely similar, not reminiscent, but exact. It was as though the woman he had buried under the magnolia tree had returned, wearing another's skin. That night, Whitmore could not sleep. He sat alone in his study, staring at the portrait of his late wife that hung above the fireplace. The longer he looked, the less certain he was of the differences between the two women. Grief had blurred his mind, but now that blur had turned into conviction. He began to think that Clara was no ordinary woman, that she was proof of what he had begun to suspect after Eleanor's death, that the soul was not bound by race, body, or time. Perhaps God, or something older than God, had sent her back to him. Perhaps this was his penance, or his deliverance. By the third day, Whitmore began to speak to Clara alone. He would call her out to the porch at dusk, where the dying sun turned the air golden and heavy. At first, he asked simple questions: where she was from, how old she was, whether she remembered her parents. Her answers were short, cautious, but her eyes never left his. "I don't remember much," she said once, "only that I was taken young." The honesty in her tone disturbed him. He wanted her to tremble, to defer, to play her role in the pattern of power that had governed his world. But she didn't, and in that refusal he saw something sacred. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but her words carried a calm certainty that eroded his authority. He found himself listening, truly listening, for the first time in his life. The other women grew uneasy with how often he visited. They whispered at night, wondering what he wanted from her and why she didn't seem afraid. One of them, Ruth, warned Clara not to speak too freely. "He's the master," she whispered. "He's not to be trusted." But Clara's reply was simple. "Fear makes him stronger." The others did not understand what she meant, but Whitmore would later repeat those very words in his diary. Over and over, "Fear makes him stronger," as if she had unlocked some forgotten truth within him. In those brief encounters, she seemed to dissolve the distance between slave and master, guilt and grace. It terrified him as much as it fascinated him. He began to bring her things from the main house: books, candles, pieces of fine fabric, even one of Eleanor's hairbrushes. When he handed it to her, she turned it over in her hands slowly, as though she recognized it. He watched her fingers trace the engraved initials on the handle. E.W. The way she looked at those letters made him feel as though she knew everything: his loss, his sin, his longing. The illusion deepened. He began to believe she carried Eleanor's memories inside her, that her presence was not coincidence but design. Some nights he would sit outside her cabin for hours, listening to her hum softly to the others, the sound threading through the night like a lullaby he half remembered. He would close his eyes and imagine that voice coming from the parlor of his old life, the piano playing softly, Eleanor laughing beside him. Soon, the line between remembrance and reality vanished. Whitmore stopped referring to her as Clara, calling her Eleanor when they were alone. At first she did not respond, but gradually she began to meet his delusion with silence rather than correction. It was not submission, it was pity. She seemed to see his unraveling, to understand that his grief had hollowed him out, leaving only desperation behind. That pity became dangerous. The more gently she spoke, the deeper his obsession grew. He began reading aloud to her from Eleanor's favorite passages in Scripture, twisting the words to fit his fantasies of rebirth and divine mercy. "God gives and takes away," he would whisper, "but sometimes he returns what he's taken." Clara never contradicted him, but her expression grew sadder each time he said it. The plantation itself began to mirror his decay. Workers whispered that the master had lost his mind, that he was haunted by the ghost of his wife. Overseers avoided the main house altogether, unnerved by the sounds that came from it: piano keys pressed at night, though no one sat at the bench, footsteps on the upper floors when Whitmore slept downstairs. They said the air had changed, that even the wind seemed to carry voices. The 7 women became symbols of that unease. The men in the fields called them the Cursed 7, believing they had brought something unnatural with them. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. Whitmore had brought the curse himself. One evening, as thunder rolled across the distant hills, Whitmore asked Clara to sit with him in the parlor of the big house. It was the first time she had entered it. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The furniture, covered in white sheets, resembled ghosts frozen in place. On the mantel stood a single candle beside a framed portrait of Eleanor. He motioned for Clara to sit near the fire, his hands trembling slightly as he poured wine into 2 glasses. "I want you to see something," he said, his voice rough. He handed her the portrait, the painted face of a woman with pale eyes and a faint, sad smile. "Do you see her?" he asked. Clara studied it for a long moment before answering. "She looks tired," she said quietly, like someone waiting to rest. The simplicity of her response broke something inside him. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound, and whispered, "She's not resting. She's here." After that night, something shifted permanently. Whitmore stopped writing letters to his dead wife. He stopped attending to the business of the plantation. His world narrowed to the small orbit of the cabin and the woman inside it. Clara began to feel the weight of his fixation closing in around her. The kindness he had shown at first turned heavy, possessive, suffocating. He began insisting she stay near him at all times, forbidding the others from speaking to her when he wasn't present. The overseers, sensing the storm building within him, whispered that he was under a spell. But if anyone had power over Silas Whitmore, it was not witchcraft. It was his own conscience, clawing its way to the surface through the face of a woman who refused to be afraid. And though Clara did not yet understand it, her very existence on that cursed land would set in motion the final undoing of the man who thought he could buy redemption with blood and memory. As autumn crept over Alabama, the Whitmore estate sank deeper into silence. The once lively plantation, where the rhythm of chains and commands had filled the air, now seemed suspended in an unnatural stillness. Fields that had once yielded endless rows of cotton now stood half-harvested, the workers avoiding the main house as though something malignant lived there. The overseers spoke less, their eyes darting toward the windows where they sometimes saw the flicker of candlelight at impossible hours. Inside, Whitmore had sealed himself away, consumed by a fever that had no cure. He no longer spoke of business or weather or crops. His words were for Clara and for ghosts. Clara's world had shrunk to the walls of that decaying mansion. He made her move into Eleanor's old room, insisting it was her rightful place. She resisted at first, but resistance brought a new kind of danger. He was no longer the cold, rational man who had once commanded others by sheer will. Something inside him had cracked open, and what poured out was neither grief nor desire, but delusion. He called her Eleanor without hesitation now, and the name clung to the air like smoke. He spoke to her as though she were a mirror of his own torment, begging for forgiveness one moment, raging at betrayal the next. The staff avoided him altogether, whispering that their master was talking to the dead. One night, as rain beat against the windows, Whitmore sat before the fire, staring into the flames as though waiting for them to answer him. Clara stood a few steps away, silent, her hands folded in front of her. He had been drinking again. The sharp smell of whiskey clung to the room. "Do you know what they say about me, Eleanor?" He slurred. "They say I'm cursed, that you've come back to haunt me. But you haven't, have you? You came back to forgive me." He turned his eyes toward her, the pupils wide, unfocused. "Tell me you forgive me," he whispered. Clara didn't move. She knew better than to reply too quickly. After a moment, she said softly, "Forgiveness isn't mine to give, sir." Her words struck him like a blade. He rose from the chair, pacing, his breath ragged. "Not yours?" he repeated. "Then whose is it, God's? You think he still listens to me?" He laughed, a sound that bordered on madness. "No, he sent you." "You're the proof, flesh and bone, standing before me. Don't you see? You're," her soul returned. "You're my salvation." Clara's calm was steady, but her heart hammered beneath her ribs. She had seen men lose their minds before, men broken by war, hunger, cruelty, but never had madness taken such a quiet, deliberate form. He wasn't raving wildly. He was reasoning with his own delusion, trying to make her part of it. The following days blurred together. Whitmore stopped allowing the 7 women to work in the fields, keeping them close to the house instead. "Family," he called them. "My household." He dressed them in faded gowns left behind by his late wife, arranging them at the dining table like mourners at an eternal wake. Clara sat at the head, silent, while Whitmore spoke of destiny, sin, and rebirth. Sometimes he read from the Bible, his voice trembling, skipping lines, twisting meaning. "The Lord restores what was lost," he would mutter. "Even the dead he brings back." The women sat stiffly, their eyes lowered, waiting for each strange sermon to end. By November, Clara realized that escape might be impossible. Every path off the property was watched, and Whitmore's obsession had become total. Yet something inside her refused to break. She began keeping fragments of her thoughts hidden in scraps of paper, buried beneath a loose floorboard in Eleanor's room. On one she wrote, "He sees what he wants, not what is." On another, "Pity is not mercy." She had started to understand that Whitmore's madness wasn't merely grief. It was guilt turned inward, a lifetime of cruelty now demanding meaning. And in his eyes, she was the vessel for that meaning, the proof that God had not abandoned him. One cold evening, Whitmore called her to the parlor again. The fire was dying, casting long, uneven shadows across the walls. On the mantel lay a lock of hair tied with ribbon, Eleanor's, preserved like a relic. He picked it up reverently and held it out to Clara. "You remember this," he said. His voice was barely a whisper, shaking. "You tied it yourself the night before you fell ill." Clara stared at the hair, its pale strands glinting in the firelight. "You should let her rest," she said quietly. But Whitmore shook his head violently. "She can't rest until I do. And I can't rest until you remember who you are." For a moment, Clara felt the chill of true danger. His face had changed. Something desperate and wild flickered beneath the surface. He stepped closer, gripping her wrist with trembling fingers. "Say my name," he begged. "Say it the way you used to." She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Sir," she began, her voice steady but strained. "You're hurting me." That simple sentence broke the trance. He let go, his expression collapsing into confusion. He stumbled back, covering his face with his hands, whispering to himself, "What am I doing? What have I become?" He sank into the chair, trembling like a child. That night, Clara waited until he fell asleep at his desk, the whiskey bottle still half full. She crept into the study and found his journal lying open. The pages were filled with fragmented thoughts, names, and drawings, Eleanor's face over and over, sketched in shaky lines. Beneath one entry dated October 29th, he had written, "If she is not Eleanor, then I am already damned." On the next page, "But if she is, then God still sees me." It was the writing of a man trying to build a bridge across madness. The next morning, something in Whitmore's demeanor shifted again. He was quieter, calmer, almost gentle. He invited Clara to walk with him through the orchard, where the last of the leaves clung to the branches. "I want to show you something," he said. They walked in silence until they reached a small plot near the magnolia tree, Eleanor's grave. The ground was overgrown, the stone weathered and almost unreadable. "Here," he said softly. "Here is where she lies. But you see why I can't believe it, don't you? You stand beside me breathing, and she's still here." Clara didn't answer. She looked at the grave, then at him, and said, "The dead don't come back, sir. They wait for us to let them go." Whitmore's eyes filled with tears. For a moment he looked like a man awakening from a long nightmare. "Let them go," he repeated under his breath, as though trying to remember how. They stood in silence for a long time, the wind whispering through the trees. When he finally turned back toward the house, his steps were slower, uncertain, as though every part of him was unraveling. But that calm did not last. That evening, a worker reported seeing Whitmore digging near the grave in the dark, muttering to himself. By dawn, he was gone. The servants found the parlor empty, the front door wide open, and muddy footprints leading toward the woods. When they searched, they found no trace of him, only the remnants of the grave disturbed, and the hair ribbon left upon the stone. Clara watched the search party from the window, her face unreadable. She did not cry. She only whispered the words she had written weeks earlier. "He sees what he wants, not what is." And for the first time, the silence around the plantation felt clean, as though something heavy had finally been lifted from the earth. In the weeks that followed Whitmore's disappearance, the plantation descended into a strange, almost sacred quiet. The men who had worked the fields moved cautiously, speaking in low tones as though afraid the land itself might hear them. Some believed the master had drowned in the river that cut through the woods. Others whispered that he had gone mad and buried himself beside his wife. No one dared to search too deeply. The overseers, once bold and cruel, left one by one, abandoning the house that everyone now called the widow's place. The mansion sat hollow against the gray Alabama sky, its windows like blind eyes, its halls echoing with a sound that wasn't quite silence, more like a breath that refused to end. Clara and the other 6 women were left behind, free in name but trapped by isolation. There was nowhere to go. The nearest town was miles away, and the world beyond was no safer than the one they had endured. So they stayed, tending to the garden, keeping the house from collapsing under its own sorrow. Clara took charge quietly, not as a leader, but as a caretaker. She moved through the rooms that still smelled faintly of Whitmore's cologne, through the parlor where the piano keys gathered dust, through Eleanor's room where the curtains fluttered like pale ghosts. Each night she lit a single candle in the window overlooking the orchard. She said it was for the lost, not only Whitmore, but everyone buried under the weight of his sins. The winter of 1853 was harsh. Frost crept into the walls, and the nights seemed to last longer than the days. The women huddled together for warmth, sharing stories of the lives they had before captivity. Clara rarely spoke of herself. When asked, she would only say, "I remember light," then darkness, then this. But her silence had changed in tone. It no longer carried fear. It was the silence of someone who understood the shape of suffering and had decided not to let it define her. The others drew strength from that. The plantation, once a place of cruelty and command, became something else, a sanctuary for the broken to remember what it meant to be whole. One evening, as the women sat around the fire, one of them asked the question that had lingered unspoken since Whitmore's disappearance. "Do you think he's dead?" Clara didn't answer right away. The firelight flickered across her face, softening its edges. "Some things die long before the body does," she said finally. The room fell silent again. They all knew what she meant. In his obsession, Whitmore had already buried himself. His body's absence was only a formality, but the land seemed to remember him differently. Strange things began to happen as spring approached. The orchard, which had gone barren since Eleanor's death, bloomed early, its branches heavy with white flowers. The workers who occasionally passed through on their way north swore they heard piano music drifting from the main house at night. A trader once claimed he saw a figure standing by the magnolia tree at dawn, a man in a coat, head bowed, holding a ribbon in his hand. He said when he called out, the figure turned and vanished into mist. Word of these things spread quietly, feeding the plantation's legend. Whitmore's Rest, they began to call it, a place where the past refused to stay buried. Clara never denied the stories. Sometimes, when she walked past the grave, she would stop and listen, as though expecting an answer. She had stopped fearing the dead. What haunted her more were the living, the men who still believed ownership was their birthright, the world that saw women like her as ghosts, even when they breathed. She knew Whitmore's madness had not been born in isolation. It had been shaped by the same hunger that ruled the South, the belief that one soul could possess another. His downfall was merely the shadow of a larger sickness. One night in late April, a storm rolled in from the east. The sky turned black and thunder cracked open the horizon. The women barred the windows, but Clara stayed outside beneath the porch, watching the lightning illuminate the fields. In one flash, she thought she saw a figure by the magnolia tree again, still, solemn, half swallowed by rain. She didn't move toward it this time. Instead, she whispered into the wind, "You can rest now." The next flash of lightning revealed nothing but empty ground. When she went inside, she felt a calm settle over her, deeper than sleep. Days turned into weeks. The house aged quickly, surrendering to vines and moss. By summer, the 7 women began to leave one by one, following rumors of safe passage north or west. They embraced Clara before they went, thanking her for giving them something they had never known before. Not freedom exactly, but peace. When the last one departed, Clara remained. She tended the grave, kept the gardens alive, and wrote in the journal she had found in Whitmore's study. But her entries were not confessions. They were observations, of birds, of weather, of the way time softened cruelty without erasing it. On one page she wrote, "He believed God sent me back to save him. Maybe God sent me to witness him instead, to learn what power does to men who have never been denied it." By the autumn of that year, travelers who passed by the plantation described seeing smoke from the chimney again, and sometimes a woman in white standing on the porch. They said she looked neither young nor old, her face calm but unreadable. Some claimed she was Whitmore's ghost in another form. Others said she was his penance, bound to the land until history itself learned mercy. None of them knew her name. Years later, after the war ended and the South began to rebuild its broken myths, The Whitmore estate was rediscovered. The new owners found the house in ruins but strangely intact inside, as if someone had cared for it long after it should have fallen. On the mantel, they found the same framed portrait of Eleanor Whitmore, its glass uncracked despite the years. Beside it lay a single candle, burned almost to the wick, and a folded note written in a neat, careful hand. Every soul wants to be seen, even the ones that hide behind power. The handwriting matched none of the plantation's old records. The grave beneath the magnolia had 2 stones now, one worn, one new. The second bore no name, only the inscription, "She made silence speak." As generations passed, the story of Silas Whitmore and the 7 women became folklore. Some called it a ghost tale, others a lesson in guilt. But those who visited the land late in the evening spoke of something subtler. They said that if you stood near the magnolia tree when the wind blew from the river, you could hear a woman's voice humming faintly, a melody that rose and fell like prayer. It wasn't a song of sorrow, nor of love lost. It was something older, quieter, a remembrance that even in the darkest corners of history, the truth finds a way to breathe. By the time decades had passed, the Whitmore plantation had become less a place than a whisper. Travelers on the old Alabama road spoke of it only in fragments, a house that no longer stood, a grave beneath a magnolia that refused to die, and a woman who was seen there long after she should have been dust. What had once been a seat of cruelty was now a ruin claimed by the earth, its past preserved only through rumor, memory, and the uneasy quiet of southern nights. But the story of what happened there did not vanish. It changed shape, as stories often do, reshaped by the mouths that dared to tell it and the silences that refused to. In the years after the Civil War, when the South bled itself dry of its old illusions, former slaves who had lived near the Whitmore estate spoke of Clara in reverent tones. They called her the woman who stayed. Some said she had freed the others and vanished into the woods. Others insisted she lived until her hair turned white, tending the graves and speaking softly to the wind. No one agreed on how she died, only that when the house finally collapsed, there was no body found. But there was always that candle in the window, burning down to nothing and somehow relit by morning. The locals said she kept it for the restless, the ones who had suffered in silence, and the ones who had inflicted suffering without ever naming it. When historians stumbled upon Whitmore's letters decades later, they found pages of obsession preserved in the rot. His handwriting grew increasingly unstable, the ink sometimes smeared by what might have been tears. But what fascinated scholars most were the notes written in another hand, feminine even, steady, Clara's handwriting. It seemed she had begun to respond in his journals toward the end, not to comfort him, but to bear witness. Her words were sharp, clear, and hauntingly modern. You believed ownership made you godlike. But even God weeps for what he creates in vain. And later, there is no redemption without recognition. You wanted me to forgive what you never named. Those lines unsettled the historians who read them, because they exposed something deeper than the madness of a single man. They revealed the moral rot at the core of an entire age. Whitmore was not unique. He was merely one of many men who mistook domination for love and memory for resurrection. Yet Clara's presence in his story transformed what might have been another tale of cruelty into something else entirely, a reckoning. Through her calm defiance, she forced Whitmore to confront what he had buried beneath faith and fear. In her silence, she made him hear the echo of every soul he had broken. She became the mirror he could not escape. By the late 19th century, the plantation was swallowed by forest. Ivy draped over the bricks like funeral cloth, and the magnolia tree grew wider, its roots splitting the earth. Children who played nearby told stories of a woman in white who appeared in the fog carrying a lantern. They said she looked neither angry nor sad, only watchful. The older folks warned them not to disturb her. "She's waiting," they would say, "for him or for all of us." But they never explained what that meant. In the South, ghosts are rarely just ghosts. They are memory, justice, and warning intertwined. When the 20th century dawned, the story took on new life. Writers began to reinterpret the legend of Silas Whitmore and the woman who changed his fate. Some painted her as a tragic figure, a victim who could not escape her captor's madness. Others saw her as something far more powerful, a spirit of conscience that outlasted its oppressor. Her defiance became symbolic of something larger, The quiet rebellion that lived within every person denied their humanity. She was not loud, not vengeful. She simply endured, and that endurance itself became a kind of victory. In 1932, an author from Montgomery published a serialized account, titled The Ghosts of Whitmore Hill. He described Clara as the stillness that outlasted empire. His words ignited a debate that stretched far beyond literature. Could one woman's silence condemn a system? Could one act of endurance ripple through time and undo what history had hidden? The book was banned in parts of the South, but it spread nevertheless, passed hand to hand, read in secret. For many, it was the first time they had seen the story of a slave told not through suffering alone, but through strength that needed no witness. As the civil rights era arrived, the myth took another shape. Activists invoked Clara's name in speeches and songs. "Let silence speak," one leader said at a rally in Birmingham, quoting the inscription from the nameless grave. Her story became a symbol of how memory resists erasure, how even when the world forgets, the land remembers. And perhaps that was the truest part of the legend. Not the ghosts, not the hauntings, but the endurance of remembrance itself. Because every injustice leaves an imprint, and every soul denied the right to speak will eventually find a voice through those who do. In the modern era, archaeologists finally unearthed the foundations of the old Whitmore estate. Beneath the magnolia tree, they found the two stones, one nearly devoured by moss, the other still bearing the faint inscription, "She made silence speak." Nearby, they discovered remnants of candle wax, layered and hardened by decades of renewal. It appeared that someone had continued lighting candles there long after the house was gone. When the findings were reported, journalists called it a haunting memorial to the unspoken history of the South. Yet what struck visitors most was the feeling of stillness that hung over the place, not eerie, but solemn, as though the air itself had learned reverence. For those who studied the story deeply, it was no longer about the ghost of Silas Whitmore, or even the woman he tried to possess. It was about transformation. A man consumed by his own guilt had been forced to see humanity where he once saw property. A woman stripped of her name had reclaimed her identity, not through rebellion or revenge, but through unwavering truth. Together their tragedy became testimony. It revealed that the most haunting part of history is not its violence, but its capacity to repeat itself when forgotten. Today, few traces of the plantation remain. The land is wild again, covered in long grass and soft wind. Travelers who visit say that when dusk falls, the magnolia blossoms give off a faint glow, as if lit from within. They claim that if you stand there long enough, you'll hear two voices carried on the breeze, one pleading, one forgiving, both fading into harmony. No one knows whether it's real or simply what people need to believe. But perhaps that's the point. History isn't just what happened. It's what refuses to disappear. In that sense, Clara's legacy endures, not as a ghost, but as a question. What does it mean to be free when memory itself still binds us? Her story, buried in the soil of Alabama, reminds us that every act of cruelty leaves behind something sacred, a demand to be remembered, to be understood, to be told correctly this time. And as long as someone lights a candle in a window, somewhere in the dark, the silence she taught to speak will never truly end. If you've made it this far, you already know. This wasn't just a story about one man's madness or one woman's endurance. It was a reflection of a time when power was mistaken for divinity, when ownership was disguised as love, and when silence carried the weight of truth. Stories like this aren't meant to entertain. They're meant to awaken something. They remind us that history's ghosts don't vanish. They linger, whispering lessons we're too afraid to learn. Here on this channel, we uncover those forgotten stories, the buried truths, the dark corners of history, and the moments humanity tried to erase. Every week we peel back another layer of the past to reveal how it still shapes the world we live in today. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you question, or even made you uncomfortable, that's the point. Because history should never let us rest easy. So before you go, take a second to subscribe. Join a community that refuses to look away from the uncomfortable truths of our past. Turn on notifications, because each video brings you deeper into the shadows of real history, where morality, guilt, and redemption still fight for meaning. And tell us in the comments below, what do you think happened to Clara? Was she a ghost, A survivor or something beyond both? Your voice keeps these stories alive. Let's remember together the history that was never meant to be told.